Having pinpointed this man on the footage, they now were trying to break down what information they had. He was clearly trying to hide his identity from the cameras.
The police made a huge discovery. They found that her iPhone had been backing up to her computer. They found thousands of text messages. Around 2,500 of those were with somebody called David.
She didn't want knife play, but a knife was soon reintroduced back into the relationship, and he was again stabbing her and back in total control.
Predominantly the conversation was in relation to their BDSM relationship, but there were times and little nuggets of information, and those particular details would prove crucial in the Garda investigation. Ultimately, they led them to lift the mask of this mystery man. They led them to the door of Graham Dwyer. Graham Dwyer had been identified as their #1 suspect. He clearly wasn't aware of it, but a surveillance operation was put in place and his movements were followed as the Garda investigation continued.
The question that might well be asked is, who was Graham Dwyer? Who's the person who could have done such a thing? Well, the first thing to say about him, he was the least likely person, if you saw him, that could commit such a heinous act. He was 5'5", a small man, portly, plain looking, living in Dublin 18 in Foxrock in a very nice road. The last man you might suspect of such a terrible act.
He was a classic, what we would describe as a Celtic tiger cub. He was an architect. He had come up during the boom times in Ireland when everybody was spending mad money on homes and designing them and spending 3 times their value on building an extension out the back. And he'd become quite well known within that, doing well. His wife, Gemma, was also an architect. They had met in college. They had married, loads of friends, quite a good social life, and they had also had 2 children after their marriage. They were in childcare. They were the usual busy couple.
This was the man next door. This was someone anyone would know. Anyone could have come across him in business. You would have asked him for directions on the street. And yet, this man had a very, very, very dark side.
The Gardaí who were tasked with following him didn't notice any change in his behaviour, didn't notice any change in his movements. He'd go to work the same time he always did. He'd return home the same time he always did. And despite the increased media attention after Elaine O'Hara's remains were found in Killikee Mountains, he seemed unfazed by all that. The whole country was talking about it at this stage. There was a public appeal for information that did harvest some good leads, but Graham Dwyer seemed unperturbed by it.
So this is somebody who's highly in control and highly able to compartmentalise their life in kind of having that separation of this is the family thing, this is the other thing that I do. And somebody with that high degree of control is somebody who is going to express that in a whole host of realms of their life.
A psychopath is somebody that exhibits, signs of an antisocial personality disorder, a callousness, a carelessness in how they treat other people and their feelings, perhaps a feeling that their needs must be met above all, ahead of anybody else's.
The irony about people like Graham Dwyer and psychopaths is they depend an awful lot on other people's opinion, high opinion of themselves for their self-esteem. So there's lots of reasons why they should resist their urges. They've got family, they've got children, innocent, lovely children. Lives will be ruined to a certain extent, particularly if they're caught, because they lose their income, they lose their freedom, they lose everything. but that becomes, at some stage, an impossibility.
Police were aware that this was a very dangerous man. There was also no cause of death, and they didn't want to jump the gun. What they essentially had was a circumstantial body of evidence that they were still building up.
The analysis of the text messages which they had managed to retrieve showed that contact between the Garoon phone and Elaine O'Hara had ceased a few months before her disappearance in August 2012. There was another Nokia which was recovered from the Vartry reservoir. This had been in the water, obviously, for 13 months, but Gardaí were confident that they would be able to retrieve the information, and indeed they did manage to do that, and it proved crucial in the investigation. The phone that was found in the Vartry reservoir had one contact on it, and that was Master. So this was obviously the slave phone.
Gardaí needed to find the Master phone. This was a key piece of evidence. There was another search of the Vartry reservoir. They had divers in. This was a fingertip search. It was very intricate, very detailed. They used metal detectors, and then bingo, ping, they found a Nokia phone.
So there were two phones found in the Vartry reservoir, the Nokia phones, and they became known as the master and slave phones. And while they had been lying in water and mud for over a year, forensic experts were able to retrieve some data from them. There was only one contact number on the master phone, and that was slave, and there was only one number on the slave phone, and that was master. These phones were again bought at the same time in a shop on Grafton Street.
Police could see that after the new phones had been purchased, the master and slave phones as they came to be known, that all other contact between Graham and Elaine's phones ceased.
Gardaí believed that Graham Dwyer and Elaine O'Hara used these phones to communicate exclusively with one another.
The problem the investigation team had was that the master phone wasn't registered to Graham Dwyer, so they had to put it with them. They looked at where it went, and then they looked at where Graham Dwyer went. And coincidentally, everywhere that master phone had gone in the weeks leading up to Elaine's murder, Graham Dwyer had gone too.
Sarah Sked is a civilian crime and policing analysis expert. She managed to match the phone activity on the cell mast activity of the phones with the movement of Graham Dwyer's car.
And she was incredibly thorough. She compared the phone mast records with toll booth records. She looked at dates he was known to be travelling for business or for pleasure, compared them with the movements of the master phone, and again with cars passing through areas.
The crucial date was July the 4th, 2012. Sarah Sked discovered that Graham Dwyer had been in Galway that day. His car had been spotted going through the M4 and the M6 toll booths. It was a blue Audi TT. It was registered to a South Dublin owner, and it was the only car registered to a South Dublin owner which had gone through the booth at that day. Meanwhile, his telephone had also pinged off masts in Galway, so this placed Graham Dwyer in Galway and as the owner of that phone.
It had crossed the country with him when he went home to visit his family. It had passed through every toll that he had. It had been in the city centre when he was, and it had gone back to Foxrock at night when he was going home to his wife and family. They were building the case constantly against Graham Dwyer, and while they had linked this master phone with him, the way it had travelled around the country with him, there was also one incident where the phone pinged at the mast at Bellarmine, which was where Elaine's apartment was, and it was the mast nearest her home. So his phone pinged on that mast, and then minutes later they found him walking into the apartment block on CCTV.
Most notably, they were able to retrieve text messages that were sent from the master phone to the slave phone in the lead up to Elaine O'Hara's disappearance and ultimately her death.
Once the police had the master and slave phone messages, I think that probably was enough for them. They'd built enough of a case. They felt they could proceed, and an arrest warrant was issued for Graham Dwyer.
They had coordinated 3 different teams. They wanted one at the office, one search team at the office, a search team at the house, and one team to arrest him.
The people that Graham Dwyer worked with were absolutely shocked. The Gardaí came in and they began to search his offices where he worked. They took memory sticks, they took his laptop, they took documents, they took everything that he had put his hand on.
His poor wife, I mean, the woman had no clue at that point, none, what she was married to and what she was living with. So frightening for her. Guards bursting into her home, starting to search her home, accusing her husband or certainly arresting him in connection with the murder of Elaine O'Hara. She must have been absolutely speechless. But Dwyer was confident as ever, and you know, he went with the guards in a kind of a fashion. I'll be back soon. You know, his attitude was, you've nothing on me, I've got away with this, give me all you can.
A 41-year-old man has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of Elaine O'Hara. The childcare worker's body was found in the Dublin mountains in August by a walker who spotted the human remains. Ms. O'Hara, 36, had been missing for over a year. The investigation into her death led detectives to arrest a businessman in Foxrock, Dublin this morning. The man shares his home with his wife and children.
As Graham Dwyer was being put into the back of a patrol car and taken in for questioning, there were also Gardaí knocking on the doors of other witnesses that they wanted to speak to, but that they didn't want to speak to before they arrested Mr. Dwyer, and they didn't want him to be tipped off. So this was an extremely fluid situation, and at the same time, Gardaí had a very limited window from which they could question Graham Dwyer. 24 hours might seem like a long time, but when you have to get all these witness statements in place, when you have to put these things to a witness, and when you still have to ask them an awful lot of questions about an awful lot of things, they didn't have an awful lot of time to work with. So it was crucial that they got it right.
In his first interview, Graham Dwyer denied knowing Elaine O'Hara. He said he was familiar with the case from reading the newspapers, but ultimately he seemed more concerned about his own affairs. It was quite a self-serving interview. He seemed uninterested in the fate of Elaine O'Hara and much more concerned with his own tribulations. He also was very concerned with his own reputation and how there might be headlines, architect arrested for murder.
In his initial interviews, it's safe to say that he didn't give Gardaí a lot, or so he thought, because as it turns out, he gave them quite a good bit of information, valuable information. And Detective Sergeant Peter Woods started out by developing somewhat of a rapport with Graham Dwyer, asking him about his hobbies and things like that. And during the course of that innocent conversation, or so Graham Dwyer thought, Graham Dwyer revealed that he had an interest in model aircraft. There were other elements like pay cuts, for example. So in Graham Dwyer's mind, this was just trivial stuff. This was just a bit of chat. But Peter Woods had a plan, and he was retracting, he was getting this information from him piece by piece.
Police are normally used to interviews which begin and end with the 2 words, no comment. This is, for want of a better term, a middle-class killer. He doesn't do no comment. He's a psychopath, he's Graham Dwyer, he just can't stop talking. So in many ways, he was an easier suspect than others because he's willing to talk. He may not have been willing to talk about exactly what they wanted to talk about, but this is called the baseline. And once the police had set the baseline of understanding and collaboration between them, then that was the perfect opportunity, once that trust was there, to start introducing pieces of evidence by which he would effectively confess.
In the second interview then, the guards began to show Graham Dwyer CCTV images and stills.
He kept repeating, "I didn't kill anyone. I didn't kill anyone." That's what he kept saying. He was adamant he had nothing to do with it and that he didn't know Elaine O'Hara.
For the first two interviews, he managed to keep up that confidence and that sort of smug attitude that he had, that aloofness, that sense of grandiose that he seemed to carry with him. By the third interview, the guards had informed him that Elaine had backed up her iPhone, so all the messages were there. As they started to read bits of them out, he realised he was in deep trouble. And then they started reading him the message from the master phone, which he denied was his completely. He had sent this message to Elaine where he had conversed with her about the birth of his child, but of course the real Graham Dwyer had also had a child that had been born at exactly that time. So, you know, I think the guards were beginning to see the mask was beginning to slip, and he was beginning to realise he was very vulnerable.
During the interview, the forensic science lab called, and they had results from the tests carried out on Elaine O'Hara's mattress, and they were able to inform the detectives that was a semen match with the DNA of Graham Dwyer. Having been backed into a corner with this new revelation, Dwyer told the Gardaí, "I'm not an innocent man, but I am innocent of murder."
The guards then told Graham that they had been in touch with his former girlfriend and mother of his first child, Senan. Her name was Emer McShay, and he'd been in a relationship with her in his early 20s. She had told the guards that he had discussed this idea that he had for sexual preferences and bringing a knife into the bedroom.
This was clearly an insight into the person that Graham Dwyer was. He used to bring the knives into bed. He wanted to stab her with them. She didn't want any part of that world, and their relationship came to an end.
Graham's response was that Emer would be trying to do him down, that she was just an ex, that maybe she shouldn't be believed. But the other role that Emer and Senan had was that they were able to identify Dwyer when he arrived at Elaine's apartments. They looked at the CCTV, they confirmed it was him.
He knew then that things were starting to come together, and so did the guards.
While Graham Dwyer was being interviewed in the police station, one of the other teams were searching the house, and obviously one of the first things they did up at the house at Fox Rock was to lock down the computers and to look at the back history and what sort of things he was doing on the computers.
The night before Graham Dwyer's arrest, he had been watching a snuff movie, which is a horror movie in which somebody dies. He explained to Gardaí that it was a sort of art to do with horror movie, and then he asked them to stop, to refrain from discussing it any further, because he said he was thinking of his wife and children, and then he said, "My private life is my private life."
The fifth interview then was when Graham Dwyer started to make some admissions. Clearly he couldn't ignore the fact that he knew Elaine O'Hara anymore because they had found videos. He couldn't ignore the fact that he was into BDSM and enjoyed stabbing women for that same reason, and also the evidence of his ex, Emer McShay, who said that he brought knives to bed.
Police can, of course, only hold and question suspects for a certain period of time. It was coming to the point where Graham Dwyer was going to have to either be released or charged with murder.
So the DPP is the Director of Public Prosecutions, and this is the Chief State Prosecution Service. It's the DPP that decides whether a case has any merit and should go forward to trial.
With perhaps less than an hour to go, the phone rang from the DPP's office and they walked into the room. Graham Dwyer was charged with the murder of Elaine O'Hara.
Without a cause of death, without knowing exactly how Elaine died, this was going to be one of the most controversial murder trials in the history of the state. On the 22nd of January, the trial opened in the Criminal Justice Courts near the Phoenix Park here in Dublin. And it was like nothing anyone had ever seen before. There were queues of photographers and cameramen outside. There were queues of the public waiting to go through the security barriers to get up onto the fourth floor. Even as a journalist, you had to be there before the courtroom opened at 10 or half 10 just to make sure you had your seat. There was, of course, Elaine O'Hara's family, and we also wanted to see who was going to support Graham Dwyer, who was going to be there for him, and his family were there throughout the entire trial.
Mr. Justice Carney was the presiding judge of the Central Criminal Court, and he swore the jury in. But before he did so, he told the panel that the trial was going to reveal some very difficult details, and anyone of a squeamish disposition was advised not to sit. A jury was eventually sworn in, and the trial opened a few days later. The prosecuting barrister is a man called Mr. Sean Guerin, and his opposite number was senior counsel Remy Farrell. Certainly, if you were to look around that courtroom, the last person that you would think would be capable of doing such a thing was the man sitting in the dock.
There were 4 strands to the trial. There was Dwyer's relationship with Elaine. There was all the digital backup. Then there was the circumstances of her disappearance and how her body was found. Then finally, the last thing the prosecution had to deal with was a smother explanation. Could she have taken her own life? Could there have been another man, another killer? What else could have happened?
Frank O'Hara gave moving testimony about his daughter, about her life, about her history, her mental illness, her achievements, what happened on that day and the day before, the events leading up to her disappearance. It felt like every aspect of her life was dissected.
It was an incredibly brave thing for him to do, to be able to take the stand and try and see past all the horrible stuff that was about to land into that courtroom over the next few weeks. This was a trial about a sadistic sexual predator, and his daughter was the victim of this man.
Graham Dwyer was, to me, behaving like a guy who was watching on. He had no sense of shame, no sense of embarrassment. He had this sort of cocky attitude to it all, taking notes during it, chatting and laughing and joking away. He showed absolutely no respect for the O'Hara family. His behaviour was normal for a psychopath.
One thing that stands out for me is the moment that his wife and mother of 2 of his 3 children, Gemma, gave evidence.
The day Gemma Dwyer gave evidence was probably one of the most anticipated days of the trial. Everybody wondered what it must be like to live with someone like this. Had she had any clue? Did she know? On the day, I remember she walked behind Dwyer. She walked behind him in the dock as she went up to the witness box. She clearly didn't want to be anywhere near him. And police stood near her, shielding her from Dwyer while she gave evidence.
Very traumatic for her. She had to give her evidence. She was shaking. Her voice was weak. I'd say it was the last place in the world she wanted to be. Never once made eye contact with him, never looked over at him. His wife, I suppose, had to realise that she was married to this monster and that she had slept in a bed with him, that she had children with him, that she had been duped. His friends, his work colleagues, everybody around him had that, devastating realisation that they had been in the company of a monster.
He wrote a letter to her from prison, and bits of this were read out in court by the prosecuting counsel. He insisted he hadn't done it. He told his wife Gemma not to believe the Gardaí. He referred to Elaine as that awful woman, and said that although he'd lied to Gemma and said that he didn't know Elaine, he did know her a bit. He'd just been trying to help her.
There was a television screen brought into the courtroom, and there was a video put up, and we could see a young girl on the screen with a policeman. The court was told that this was a lady by the name of Darcy Day, that she was an American girl and that she had evidence to give the trial.
Darcy said that she had met Dwyer on a fetish website. She said Dwyer confessed that he'd wanted to stab someone, that he would stab her. He'd fly across, stab her and dispose of the body. He said he'd do this after killing Elaine O'Hara, who he also mentioned to Darcy.
Graham Dwyer wrote a very intense account of what he'd like to do to Darcy Day if he ever met her. The document was entitled Killing Darcy, and it was a deeply disturbing graphic account of raping and killing a young woman and slitting her throat. And there were images of Darcy Day photoshopped onto a naked body, and you could see intestines, blood, cuts, stab wounds and a brand mark around her breast.
But very interestingly, what Graham Dwyer did to, in his mind, to hopefully ensure that she didn't give evidence, was he sent her a Christmas card. Now, the Christmas card was, for all intents and purposes, very innocent. It wished her a happy Christmas, and it suggested that if he ever travelled to the United States, that he would come visit her. Now, Graham Dwyer, she had not revealed to Graham Dwyer her home address. So Graham Dwyer had somehow found out where she lived and was sending her a clear message across the Atlantic that if she was to give evidence against him, that he would find her. He was 100% convinced that he was going to be acquitted. He did similar things with other women in his life that gave evidence against him. His wife Gemma, for example, and his ex. He had sent a letter to both. And he was trying to tell the women that he feared would give evidence, damning evidence against him. He was trying to tell them that I will soon be free.
Graham Dwyer had some horrific videos, specifically of women being tortured, raped and murdered. And these were live videos. These were what we know as snuff movies.
The defence hadn't wanted those videos to be shown. They thought it would be far too prejudicial for the jury, that the jurors would have a visceral reaction, I think was how Remy Farrell put it, that they wouldn't be able to give Dwyer a fair trial after seeing them. The prosecution argued that they should be shown because Dwyer had claimed in his police interviews that it was Elaine who was into the S&M stuff, that he was just going along with it for her sake. But the prosecution said the videos would show how much enjoyment he got from it, and that he was the leader. The judge decided that he would allow 11 videos to be shown. They cleared the public, they cleared the family. There was only members of the media left, the legal teams, the jury, the judge.
Graham Dwyer had videos of himself taking chloroform, sort of stumbling around the place. He'd videos of himself having sex with other women, violent sex. He'd videos of an equivalent level of violence in sex with Elaine O'Hara.
The video of Graham having sex with Elaine and stabbing her at the same time was the most harrowing thing I've ever seen in my life. It was actually the sound that was the worst part, because she was making these like these primal kind of pain. She was in such awful pain, and it was just horrific. It was horrific.
It brought many people in court to actual tears because of the sheer level of violence involved.
You could hear his voice most chillingly at the end saying, "There now, that wasn't too bad, was it?"
When those videos were being shown on screens around the courtroom and in the jury box, I did notice Graham Dwyer seemed to take some sort of gratification out of that. He seemed to enjoy the fact that other people were watching his work, his little home movies. But there were also two documents, fantasy documents, pieces of writing that were penned by him and found on his computer.
He'd almost written a novel or novellas about his depravity, and this was all brought before the court. So we had real evidence of his psychological disturbances. We had real evidence of his depravity, and we had real evidence of the lengths to which he was prepared to go to destroy any piece of humanity that lay in front of him for his own personal pleasures.
His fantasy stories, for me, actually, were some of the worst, because he would talk about picking a woman at random, but he'd be picking them in a location close to where we all were. He'd talk about watching a woman in her house and pretending to check a boiler or something. They were everyday scenarios. He looked like an everyday figure, but what was going on in his mind was something none of us could ever imagine. To see inside the workings of a killer like Graham Dwyer's mind is not something that anyone in that courtroom is going to shake off quickly.
Sarah Sked of An Garda Síochána was very convincing in her evidence. She had phone mast evidence and toll road evidence of both his phone pinging off relevant masts at relevant time and going through the toll road. So, for example, she could tell when he and his master phone were down in Bandon visiting his parents, what part he was in Dublin, when he came on the M50, when he went off it. This was going to be crucial and very persuasive evidence.
Other essential information included Emer McShea giving evidence of him bringing a knife into the bedroom in their relationship, showing an early interest in piquerism. And his son gave evidence of receiving a birthday card in which he said forensics were clear and that they were sure of an acquittal now that there was a mountain of evidence that it was suicide.
Prosecution evidence was so strong, was so cohesive, was so well presented by prosecuting counsel Sean Guerin. He was hugely persuasive in the way he presented the evidence, notwithstanding that it was circumstantial. You would imagine, would you not, that the defence case would still be strong standing up to that circumstantial evidence.
There were several strands to the defence in the case, but essentially it boiled down to the fact they said Graham Dwyer had no case to answer. Elaine O'Hara was a suicidal person. There was no cause of death. There was nothing that linked Graham Dwyer to the scene where her remains were found. They also argued that the relationship between Dwyer and O'Hara had been consensual, and that all the strands of the case essentially was all based on circumstantial evidence.
I'll never forget when news started to filter through the building that a verdict was imminent. People rushed to the 4th floor of the courtroom. The lifts were rammed, 4 lifts full. I took the stairs, dashed up to the courtroom. Graham Dwyer came in, again suited and booted. His father, who was there throughout, he looked back at him and mouthed the words, "It's coming, the verdict." He thought he was going to be a free man. He told one of the prison officers that he was going to be enjoying a nice steak and a nice glass of red wine that evening, that he was going to be celebrating being released from prison.
Then the doubt started to come in that he probably wasn't going to be convicted of murder, that there wasn't enough evidence. How is the state going to prove that this woman was murdered?
There's no question that Graham Dwyer felt that he was going to get away with this crime. After all the evidence was circumstantial. He'd convinced himself and others that a court could not convict a man on circumstantial evidence. We know that Elaine had psychological issues. In fact, she had suicidal ideation all her life. We also know she was involved with the BDSM community. Furthermore, a skeleton was found. There was no real evidence. Everything pointed to a missing person stroke suicide.
And then we heard the knock on the door, and the jury filed out one by one, and I was right beside the jury, and they came around the door and they all took their seats, and everybody just felt this intensity and this anxiety and this, what's it gonna be? I bet you he got off, I bet you he got off, everybody kept saying. And then the verdict was handed over to the judge, and he was found guilty of murder.
The court was silent, except for the reaction of the O'Hara family. The man who had brutally murdered their daughter, their sister, had been found guilty unanimously by a jury and was going to serve a life sentence for that killing.
Thank God that they saw through him, that they were able to weave through that evidence, and they gave the right verdict. And the judge said it was the right verdict. And I just looked at him, and I think he was just devastated. People say he didn't react. He did react. You could sense from him that all that pride and all that gloating and all that cockiness that he had was gone.
Graham Dwyer has been jailed for life for the murder of childcare assistant Elaine O'Hara. Mr. Dwyer, an architect from Kerrymount Close, Foxrock, County Dublin, who was convicted 3.5 weeks ago, was found guilty of murdering Ms. O'Hara at Killikee Mountain on August 22nd, 2012. He had pleaded not guilty. Ms. O'Hara's remains were found in forestry on Killikee Mountain.
The way it was put in court was that Dwyer had been lucky for a long time, but when his luck turned against him, it really turned against him, and all the evidence conspired to paint a very guilty picture.
It did seem at points throughout the trial that there was a lot of coincidence, a lot of luck, but it almost felt like Elaine O'Hara was reaching out from the grave and she was helping the prosecutors bring across this conviction of putting the man that took her life in the dock and ultimately behind bars.
No one will ever know exactly what happened to Elaine O'Hara, but when a psychopathic and predatory killer announces in a series of texts that he's going to take you up to a wooded area and stab you repeatedly for sexual gratification, I think we've come pretty close to a true account of what happened to Elaine O'Hara.
begging him to leave her alone. I mean, it's so hard to understand how somebody couldn't just turn off the phone, but you see, Elaine was just at that point so very, very vulnerable and so incredibly under his control.
On the day in question, August 22nd, 2012, Graham Dwyer drove to Shangana Cemetery where he had arranged to meet Elaine O'Hara. He had been in constant contact with her throughout the day, using the master and slave phones that he bought on Grafton Street. I believe that he was beside himself with excitement because he knew that he was going to finally fulfill his ultimate sexual desire, and that was to have sex with and to kill a woman.
Everything he had done throughout the previous years was building up towards this one event.
She's completely vacant in a completely other world. We know at this point, really, that Graham Dwyer has complete control over Elaine O'Hara. And from that moment on, everything he says she should do, she does.
He picked her up and drove her to Killikee. And we know that because of the way his phone and the phone she had were pinging off masts.
It is like a horror film. It's where nobody would want to go, not even in the daytime, frankly, let alone with someone who's already professed an urge to stab you. Looking at the text messages, you just want to cry out to Elaine and say, stop, turn back, don't do it. But she did, and that had tragic consequences.
He walked her up to the side of that mountain in all likelihood. He took her behind those trees, and as we now know, he eventually murdered her.
We can assume from the evidence there at that site that he tied her to a tree. We can assume that he some way stripped her, and we can assume that he succeeded in carrying out his ultimate fantasy, which was stabbing her to death and being there and becoming aroused by that, by the blood, by his own bloodlust, and by the power he had over her, this completely vulnerable woman.
Then got into his car and drove to the Vartry Reservoir where he disposed of the killing kit. And then he drove home and his phone came back at 9 o'clock.
So he made it back to his home that night where his wife and 2 young children were, and we know that he just had a regular evening and then he carried on with his life.
Graham Dwyer most likely did not bury the body immediately because one of the other traits of this sadistic psychopath is to revisit the scene of the crime, and that would be for sexual purposes as well. And no doubt Graham Dwyer did revisit that scene a number of times.
Graham Dwyer's murder was not one of passion. Graham Dwyer is no ordinary killer. Graham Dwyer had intention writ large in this murder. He is, in my view, one of the worst murderers I've ever come across in Ireland's recent history.
All she wanted was to be loved, and he took advantage of that. He knew exactly what he was doing. He preyed on her, he relentlessly pursued her. He never gave that woman a minute's peace. And all that time she was in this desperate submissive role, and he knew exactly what he was doing.
There was a victim impact statement read at the sentencing hearing. It was written by Frank O'Hara, Elaine's dad, and it was read by Sean Guerin. He said they would never really know what happened up at Killikee Mountains, but they had a number of questions that the family still wanted answers to. When did she know that it wasn't a game anymore? When did she know her life was actually in danger? They wanted to know if she cried out, if she'd been able to cry out. They wanted to know if she'd died alone up there.